Choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that has been our motto our whole married life, that we will serve the Lord. And I think for my children and my grandchildren, that's a great motto. I think there's a shorter way that encompasses it as well. God, family, and country. So I come from a long line of very strong women. And so when I think about my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and back several generations, they were all very strong, independent women who went through really hard times. And so when things get a little hard for me, and they have, I think about that, and I think about the heritage that I have. And they went through hard times and came out on top and on the other side of it, and so I think I can do that too. And so that's been a strength to me through my whole life as I thought about those various women that sacrificed a lot and gave up a lot, but were committed to what they believed and what they wanted to accomplish. In the beginning of our country, we had people that came on the Mayflower, which was the very first people that came, well, other than the Native Americans, came to America, and they left England for religious freedom. They weren't allowed to worship as they felt was the right thing to do. And so they were called separatists. And they first left England and then went to Holland because they could practice the religion in Holland. But they left Holland and decided to come to America. So a whole shipload of them came. And our ancestors, the Samuel and Edward Fuller, were on that ship with their wives and children, one child. The husband and one set of those parents, Edward and his wife, died that very first winter in Plymouth. It was a very hard winter, but their son survived and was raised by his uncle, who was the ship's doctor. And then he lived to marry and have children, and that's where we descend through that. And each generation of those women had difficult times, and often we read about the men and what the men accomplished, but we have to remember that the women were there behind them and supporting them and doing all the things at home that needed to be done, and with great courage and just steadfast conviction. So my great-grandfather lived in New York. They had hit this, so now that was 1620 when they first came, and so now we moved down into the 1800s, which is 200 years later. 200 years is a long time to be in a country, and so a lot of people have been born and the family's grown. And so my great-grandfather, Elijah Knapp Fuller, lived in New York, and he heard about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he wanted to know more. And so he walked 60 miles to find somebody from the church, some missionaries that could teach him the gospel. And he was baptized with his wife and their whole family. They then left New York and went to Nauvoo, where the church was then there located. And while they were in Nauvoo, his wife and 3 of his children died, and leaving him with 3 children to raise on his own. And so there began my history in the church. They had hard times. They were persecuted. They were driven from place to place, but they never faltered. They believed what they believed was correct and right, and they were committed to serve God, and this is what they did. So they came west, they came to Salt Lake, and then several years later were sent to St. George as a group of 300 families to settle in the St. George area. There was nothing there, just desert. There was a river that ran through there. They were sent to raise cotton. That was their job, because it was the time of the Civil War, and they needed cotton in the West and couldn't get it out of the South. So they were successful in that endeavor and did raise cotton and had a cotton mill and all of those things. But after the Civil War, when the South began producing cotton again, they discontinued raising cotton in St. George. But in the meantime, they had established a community. And so my great-grandfather, after his wife died in Nauvoo, he married again and had a couple of children. Then he became a polygamist. He had more than one wife. And so when my great-grandmother, Ellen Celeste Woodward, when she came from Massachusetts to Salt Lake, he was recommended to her as a good man to marry, and so she did. She was 20 and he was, I think, 30 at the time. Anyway, they came to St. George. They had 8 children together. An interesting thing about them, though, is before that, he was sent to what is now Las Vegas, which was then just a spring and an Indian outpost. He was sent as a missionary to the Indians. And he took his young wife and his 3 children from his first wife and took them to what is now Las Vegas. And I can't remember what it called it then, some kind of spring, and I can't remember the name. But there she had their second baby, and she was the first white baby born in what is now Las Vegas. And so while they were there, and the husband was out working with the Indians, a group of Indians came to their little encampment and really just terrorized her, took the baby and acted as if they were going to kill the baby, and really scared her half out of her wits. But she eventually was able to give them food and get them to give her back her baby and to leave. But when her husband came back from his trip, she was packed and ready to go. And she said, "I cannot stay here with these children." What she really said is, this is in their history, "I cannot live in this godforsaken place." So they left and came back to Salt Lake. After that, they were sent then down to St. George. So by then they had 8 children together, and plus his 3 from previous marriage. And they lived in a little place called, just escaped to me, but I'll think of it in a minute. It will float back through. Because that's where, Harrisburg. A little place called Harrisburg. It's just a few miles north of St. George. And that's where my grandmother was born. Katie Clove Fuller was born in Harrisburg. And shortly after that, I think my great-grandmother, her mother, Ellen Celeste Woodward, she could see the writing on the wall, I think, that polygamy was going to be discontinued. And so with the 3 boys that were his from the first marriage, she took her children and they went to Arizona to settle some communities in Arizona. And the boys were now grown men and had families of their own. And they had gone to Arizona previously and had located a little area under the Mogollon Rim that they called Pine and Strawberry. And that's where they went. And that's where they were ranchers and they needed a place to raise cattle. And there was lots of water there. There was lots of grass. And it was a really beautiful place, especially compared to Harrisburg, which is just out in the desert, and there's hardly any water. And it's really hard to make a living there. So they went across the Colorado River and down over the Grand Canyon and down through northern Arizona, through the Indian Reservation, and down to a little place called Sunset. And they stayed the winter in Sunset, because they couldn't make it over the mountain because of the snow. So Sunset is just outside of the place of Winslow, which is now Winslow, but it was just a little LDS encampment by the Colorado River. So they stayed there for the winter, and then when spring came, they went over the mountain and down. The road, the wagon trail was so rough and so scary going down over the rim that my great-grandmother would not let her children ride in the wagon. She made them walk down because she was so afraid the wagon would get loose and would run over the horses and just would crash, and she was so afraid for them. My grandmother was 12 at the time. And so they settled in a little town called Pine. The first year they lived inside of a fort because the Geronimo and the Apache Indians were on the warpath. And they ate mostly cornmeal mush. And my grandmother, after they came out of there, and for the rest of her life, she would never eat cornmeal mush because she had eaten it for that whole year and said that she couldn't bear to put it in her mouth one more time. So that they settled that little community of Pine and Strawberry and flourished there. Most of them were ranchers, and they just had a wonderful life there. My great-grandmother, Ellen Celeste Woodward, of course now she was a single mom because her husband didn't come with her. He stayed in Harrisburg with his young wife and their family with the intent to come down a little later. They were going to join, and they were going to come a little later. That was the plan. So she opened a general store and ran a store. She traded with the Indians and also with the settlers that were settling that. It wasn't the state of Arizona at the time, it was the territory of Arizona. And so my mother was born there, and so she was born in the territory of Arizona before Arizona became a state. And all of her siblings were born there at that time. So that's where she was living when my father came. But before that, my grandmother grew up there. She went there when she was 12, and so she grew up there and went to school there. During that time, my grandfather was being raised in Missouri, and he went to college and was educated and had graduated with 2 degrees, one in teaching and one in medicine. He intended to become a doctor, but about that time he got tuberculosis, and the doctors told him that he would need to come to the drier climate of the West or he would not survive. And so he came by horseback to Arizona. And when he got to Arizona, he started a school in Oak Creek Canyon near Sedona. And it was the first school with a teacher that was college educated in the territory of Arizona. And he stayed there a few years, and then for whatever reason, I don't know, he moved over to Pine and became a school teacher there. And the little school where he taught has been restored and is still in existence in Strawberry, and it's very fun for me to go there and envision him there teaching, and my mother sitting in the chairs and in those same chairs. And they do have I want to say roles, but that's not what you want to call them. It's like, lists of students. Attendance. Attendance rolls. And all my aunts and uncles are listed, and my mom, and it's very cool to see that and realize where they went to school and how primitive it was there. Just a one-room schoolhouse. And while he was there teaching, my grandfather got shot. He apparently disciplined a child a little harshly, maybe, and the father of the child came and was threatening him, and my grandfather threw up his hand like that, and the guy shot him through the hand, and forever after he had a sore on his hand right here that he picked at a lot. It never really healed properly, and it eventually, in his much later years, he developed cancer in that, but he never knew that because my mother never told him that it was, but it was in his later years. Anyway, it was the Wild West, and that's where they lived. And my mother and her siblings all were raised in a nice community that was mostly all LDS. But my grandfather was not LDS, was not, and so his children were not ever baptized into the church. So that's where my mother was when she met my father. And this gets a little convoluted when I try to switch families and all of that, but my father came from Utah, and there's more history than that, but I'll take that later. But he had a brother who lived in Pine who was ill, and his family was suffering, and it was during the Depression. And he got word that his brother's family was really in bad shape. And so he got on a freight train and rode that freight train from Utah to Phoenix. And he said that he thought he was going to freeze to death in that freight car. But anyway, he got to Phoenix, and so then he got off the freight train and he started walking. And he walked almost all the way to Pine, but I think about maybe Pumpkin Center, someplace in that area. He caught the mail stage and came into Strawberry. And my Aunt Hazel, who was the wife of his brother, my Aunt Hazel saw him coming down the lane and said, because she had been sitting with her children, not knowing what she was going to have to eat and not knowing what on earth they were going to do, because the husband was sick and couldn't work. And she looked up and saw my dad and said, "Praise the Lord, it's Jack." And forever after, she always praised my dad for coming to their rescue. And he lived with them and went to work for the Arizona Highway Department and gave his check to Hazel for 3 years. And he just kept out enough money to buy his cigarettes and what few little incidentals he might need. But he supported that family for 3 years. And during that time, he met my mother, who was a divorced person with a little boy. And because of that, she wasn't considered really prime marriage possibility by most of the people in the community, because divorce was not looked on kindly during that time. But my dad took one look at her and said she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life, and he was gone. That was it. And so they dated for a couple of years, and then they married in December of 1937 and lived in Pine. So I was born in 1939 in January, and there were no doctors in Pine, and my grandmother was a midwife. But my mother had had some complications with my older brother when she had him, and so she felt like she needed to get where there was a real doctor. So she went to Cottonwood, which is about 60 miles away. And at that time, they just stayed in the house of the doctor. There wasn't a hospital or anything like that. They just went to the doctor's home, and he took care of the delivery, and then they stayed in the doctor's home for 2 weeks, and they were looked after there. So I guess I gave the hint that I was coming on January the 1st. So my dad quickly drove my mother to Cottonwood, which, when I say quickly, it probably took them 2 hours or more to make that 60-mile drive.
What did they drive? What was that?
It was an old, I don't know, some kind of an old Model T Ford kind of thing. I've seen pictures of it, but I don't know if it's a Model T, a Model A, I don't know. But anyway, it was an old car. Well, it wasn't that old of a car, but when we look back, we think, think it was old. Anyway, they went to Cottonwood, and the doctor was there, and they took my mom in, and then I wasn't born, and she just had to wait there. And she didn't really bring any clothes with her much, because she thought she would just be there a short time. But she stayed there for 2 weeks, and I wasn't born until the 13th of January. And so she had on a sort of a polka dot blue dress, and she washed it out most every night and wore it again the next day. And from then on, she would never wear a polka dot dress the rest of her life because she was so sick of that polka dot dress. Anyway, that's where I began my life. And I was born in Cottonwood, but never lived there. Only stayed there those 2 weeks when my mom was in the doctor's home. Then we went back to Pine and stayed there for a time. And during the summer, my dad worked for I think he worked for the highway department the whole time. But during the summer, they just camped out. And so we lived in a tent up in an area called Sharp Creek, where he was working on the highway. And that was not unusual during those times. People lived in tents a lot. It wasn't anything like weird. And so we started life there. And then we eventually, when I was young, we moved to a little town called Young, which was probably maybe 80, 60 or 70, 80 miles from Pine, a little farther up under the Mogollon Rim, but still up in the mountainous area. By now, my dad didn't work for the highway department. He went to work for my uncle in a sawmill. And so that's where they had the sawmill, was near Young, and so that's where we lived. And so there was just my brother and me. My brother, Neil, was 7 years older than me. And of course, he had a different dad. But my dad was the only dad he ever knew. And so he was always considered to be his son. And so I went to school there until through third grade. It wasn't a one-room schoolhouse. We had first and second grade in one room, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth in one room, and then the high school kids in another room. And so I feel like I got a really good education because we had all those grades in one room, and you could listen to all the lessons that all the classes taught. And so I've always felt like I got a really good start in those schools. But when I was going into fourth grade, we moved to Winslow, Arizona. The sawmill moved, and so my dad and mom had to move to Winslow. Well, Winslow was a big town. In today's standards, it wasn't a big town, but for us, moving from that tiny little community of about 200 people to a town with probably 4,000 people, that was a huge move. And moving from that little schoolhouse that we had to a bigger schoolhouse that had only fourth and fifth grade in it. And I had never, up to that point, I'd never seen or heard of indoor plumbing. We had an outhouse at our house, and we didn't have, we had a pump in the kitchen that we pumped water with, and we had a windmill out back that pumped our water out of the ground. And my dad, it had a tank that held the water, and my dad built us a shower underneath the windmill that you could go out and pull the cord and the water would flush over you. Then you'd soap all up, and then you'd pull the cord again and wash the soap off. So we'd never had an indoor bathroom and didn't even know there was such a thing. And we didn't have electricity, so we had no electric lights. We had kerosene lights on the walls, and my mother had a kerosene washing machine, and I'm sure we had a kerosene refrigerator that was small, but it was run by kerosene. And so when you look at the pioneer artifacts and pioneer things that the women used, I remember those from when I was a kid. And it just doesn't seem like I could have lived in pioneer days, but really I did. And so when we moved to Winslow, and I went to school the first day, and it was my first experience with an indoor bathroom. Of course, there was a door that said girls, and my vision was that there would be only one place inside, one place to go. And so I was waiting outside the door. And somebody came out, and so I tried to go in, but somebody ran past me and went in ahead of me, and I thought, well, that's rude. I'm standing here waiting to go in. Why didn't they, And so people kept going past me to go in, and I couldn't understand it. And I thought, finally, I got courage to go through the door, and there was a whole row of toilets there. Had never seen that in my life, and had no idea that there was more than one place in there to go to the bathroom. And so that was I still remember that feeling of, oh my gosh, this is so amazing.
What year was that roughly?
That was 1948.
Wow.
Yeah, 1948. I was in fourth grade. So we lived there until my junior year of high school. I finished my junior year in Winslow. And of course I had friends there, and I had relatives there. Some of my mother's siblings lived there, and so I had cousins my same age that lived there, and we had a great life there. My mother was kind of the hub of her family. She was the youngest girl, but she was the one who planned all the family events, and she was the one who invited her brothers and their families, and our house was the place where people came for the holidays. And our house was small. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, and had a little dining room and a kitchen and a small little living room. But my dad there was a front porch, and my dad enclosed that so that my brothers could sleep on the porch. My dad was a real handyman. He could make, build, fix anything. He was so good at what he did. Let me go back to young, when we lived there, and I told you we didn't have indoor plumbing, but my dad put a pump in the kitchen, and then my mother didn't have a drain board, a counter to work on in the kitchen. And so because he worked at the sawmill, he waited until a big pine tree came through to be sawed into logs, and he got a pine tree that was probably 2.5 feet wide, and he cut the big strip out of the middle of it, probably 3 inches thick, and made that into a drain board for my mother in the kitchen. And he finished it and worked on it and oiled it, and she was so proud of it. It was beautiful. And so that was the kind of guy he was. He just could fix everything. So when we moved to Winslow into that little house, it was a little 2-bedroom, 1-bath house. He built a porch on the front porch and enclosed it so that my brothers could sleep on the porch. And while we were there, not right at the beginning, but while we were there, my grandmother died, and my grandfather lived alone for a while, but then he came to live with us. So he and I shared a bedroom. It must have been a fairly big bedroom because we both had double beds, and it was in the same bedroom, so it was a fairly big room, but he and I shared that room. And I have such wonderful memories of him. And every night he would rub his feet and legs and knees with Sloan's liniment. And if you don't know what that is, it's like a horse liniment, but it would help his joints. And so every night I would go to bed with that smell of Sloan's liniment in the room, and it was so comforting to me. And so I just knew that I was safe because I was there with my grandpa. And even today, if I were to smell Sloan's liniment, I would immediately picture my grandpa sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing his feet and legs with the Sloan's liniment. But anyway, that was where I learned that my parents were very family oriented, and they instilled in us children the importance of family and how important it was to take care of each other. And my dad always said, you don't have to like each other, but if you're family, you take care of each other. And so I learned that from an early age, and I've appreciated that over the years, that was our obligation, was to take care of each other. And so when my grandfather came to live with us, it was no surprise to me at all. And I think he probably was in his late 80s when he came to live with us. Probably 88 or 89, something like that. But he was still very active. He walked every day. He had a cane, and he would go outside and walk. And he had a little route that he did, and I never went with him, so I don't know where he went, but he was usually gone about a half an hour and came back. But he was an active man. And he was extremely bright, really had a good mind. And he'd been a businessman. He had owned a sawmill, he had been a rancher, he ran cattle. He also had a store, and he was a school teacher. So he did a lot of different things. But one of the things that he and I would do when he was living with us is he would help me with my multiplication tables. And he would help me practice them. But then he also would help me with my addition, and he would give me numbers to add. He would say, okay, add 12 and 17 and 15. He said, don't write it down on paper. Anybody can do that, but just add it in your head. And he would just give me a few minutes to think about it, and he would expect that I would come up with the right answer. And I got pretty good at it. And so that has served me well my whole life, because I can figure math problems out in my head quicker than most people can figure it out on paper. And it was because of my grandfather that I learned to do that. So I went through school in Winslow, had a wonderful time, had lots of experiences with student government, that kind of thing. I always thought of myself as a big duck in a little pond, because I kind of was. And then after my junior year, my parents, the sawmill burned down in Winslow, and my uncle, who owned the sawmill, bought property out of Santa Cruz, California, and moved his mill to Santa Cruz. And my parents moved to Santa Cruz the summer before my senior year. Well, it was actually before I finished my junior year. But they let me stay in Winslow to finish my junior year. And I begged to stay with my friends and finish my senior year, but my parents wouldn't hear of it. So I moved to Santa Cruz during my senior year. So I went from a school that was fairly big for the area. We had, I think, 70 students in my class. And I moved to Santa Cruz as a senior, and we had probably 350 in our class. So I went from being a big duck in a little pond to being a no duck in a very big pond. And it was a hard transition for me. The girl who had been elected student body secretary the spring before, just for the senior year, became ill and had to vacate that position, and so it was put open to the student body. And because I had done student government before, I applied for that position, and I won. And so I was able to be in student government during my senior year, which really helped me to make friends and to feel more comfortable in the school. But I never really, a year is not long enough to establish good long-term relationships. And those kids had gone to school from kindergarten with each other, and so it was difficult. But during that time, I also, as a social thing, not as a religious thing at all, but as a social way to make friends, I started going to church, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they had a small branch there. Well, it was a ward, it wasn't a branch, but it was small. And it was mostly old retired people. And they just loved me. They just sucked me right in and loved me to death and took care of me. There were a few other teenagers in our ward. I would say there were probably 6 of us altogether. And we became very close and had some good experiences there. But really, that was the turning point for me in my church activity, because before then I had gone to church mostly as a social thing, all the dances, all the parties, all the fun stuff, but not really, didn't really understand anything about the teachings of the church. I did while I was in Winslow, I did play the piano for the junior Sunday school for 2 or 3 years. And then when I was a sophomore, the bishop asked me to play the organ for sacrament meeting. Back in those days, we met in the morning for Sunday school and in the evening for sacrament meeting. And so he said that he would pay for my lessons. And fool that I was, I said no. And it's been a regret my whole life that I didn't take him up on that and really learn how to play the organ and do that. But kids do dumb things, and that was one of my dumb things that I did when I was that age. I just said, oh, no, I don't want to do that. And I didn't, and I've regretted it. But in Santa Cruz, those people just really loved me into the church, and I was able to gain an understanding of the teachings of the church, and it made sense to me, and I felt at home there. And when I graduated high school and it came time for me to go to college, I really had planned just to go to the local junior college because it was cheap. California paid for the schooling. It was cheap for me to go, and it made sense to me. And the bishop called me into his office and asked me my plans, and I told him, and he said, no, that's not a good idea for you. He says, you need to go to BYU. And I said, well, I haven't really made a plan to do that. I haven't applied. I haven't, I haven't got the money. I haven't done anything. And he said, that's okay. He said, I have your application right here. It's all filled out. You just have to sign it. And in the meantime, he was a principal at one of the schools, not my high school, but at one of the junior highs. And he had acquired my school records and sent them to BYU and applied for scholarship for me, and I got a full ride scholarship to BYU. And so I went. So that was that year, and that decision to do that changed my life. And I will be forever grateful for that bishop for doing that for me and seeing that I got pointed in that direction. And really so grateful for that. So that's how I got to BYU, and the rest of it is a different story. So we go to let me talk a little bit about, let's see, I had in my mind what I wanted to talk about. When you get to be 84 years old, sometimes ideas come in your brain, and it's such a great idea. And then by the time it gets to your mouth, it's kind of gone. And we have to wait till it comes back in the other side again. But I'm so grateful for my heritage. I have amazing heritage, and I'm so thankful for that. It's not something to be taken lightly. We had people who have fought in every war since the beginning of our country. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the War of 1812, First World War, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War. We've had relatives in all of those wars. And they fought in those wars because they valued freedom. And that was why our relatives came here, was for freedom. Freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom to be who they wanted to be. Because in Europe you kind of were locked in. Didn't really, from the minute you were born, you were locked into what you were going to be and didn't really have an opportunity to do something different. So it was really a big deal for them to have that, and they fought and died for those things. And I think we now somewhat take it for granted, and I think we need to look carefully at the privileges and the opportunities we have and realize that we have those because of the sacrifices of so many who have gone before us and made our life so comfortable. And I tell you, when I do my laundry and I just put my clothes in the washer and I push 2 buttons and it washes. Then I go back in and I take them out and put them in the dryer. I push 1 button. I go back in later, it's all done. I remember what it was like to wash clothes in a wringer washer and to hang them on the line to dry. and how much time it took in a day to take care of the laundry. And I feel so blessed to have those advances in the things that make our life more comfortable. The other thing I think we sometimes take for granted are the advances in medicine. It's just astonishing to me, just in my short lifetime, even the last 20 years, the advances in medicine that have prolonged our life, made our life more comfortable, made us so we don't have to suffer with different diseases, that they can control so many things, and they've eliminated many things. When I was in elementary school, several of my friends had polio, and I saw the devastating results of that. Fortunately, they developed the polio vaccine, and none of my children or my cousins or none of those people have had to have polio. The same with so many diseases. So I'm so grateful for that, to be living at this time when we have those amazing advances in medicine and in technology. And my grandfather, when he came west, I already told you this, he came west on horseback. And while we lived in Winslow, my mother took him to the airport in Winslow, and a big jet airplane came in there, and it was called the Wing. And it looked just like a giant wing, just wings out both sides. It looked like a big giant triangle. And it flew in, and it was jet powered, and it was the first one that had ever come to Winslow. And my grandfather was just amazed. He said, "I came by horseback. I've seen the train, I've seen the automobile, I've seen now airplanes, and now the jet planes in my lifetime." And he said, "It's almost more than I can comprehend." And if you look now to see how we travel now, I mean, he would just be astonished to know that I came from Las Vegas to Eugene a few days ago in 2 hours, sitting in a comfortable chair, flying 500 miles an hour through the air. And it's amazing that we can do that, and we take it so for granted that we don't even give it a second thought, but we should. Let me take a breath. But anyway, let me tell you about Grandpa. You know that he was the love of my life. And I didn't meet him my first year at BYU, although he said he saw me and knew me, but I don't remember seeing him or know him. But I lived in a dormitory, and he delivered milk, and he worked at the BYU Creamery, and he delivered milk and ice cream to the cafeterias. And he was very handsome and very tall and very skinny. And the cafeteria ladies felt sorry for him because he just never had any food. You could see that he hadn't eaten because he was so skinny. So they would always feed him lunch when he brought his deliveries. They would always feed him. And so he would eat at the cafeteria, and he was always looking, I think, for girls, you know. But he says he remembers me from then, but honestly, I didn't remember him. But the next year, my sophomore year, I lived in Knight Mangum Hall, which were girls' apartments, but they were cooking apartments. So there were 6 of us in an apartment, and we had a kitchen and 3 bedrooms, and we could cook there. And they had a common living area that I think 4 apartments shared. And so during the first few weeks of school, Dennis came up and was out in the living area visiting with a lot of girls. And he was a very handsome guy, and he was very charming. And so girls just naturally gravitated to him, and so there were quite a few out there. And so I joined the group, and we were all visiting and laughing, telling jokes and whatever. And the girls eventually, after time, they just sort of went on with whatever they were going to do for the day. And it eventually ended up that Grandpa and I were the only 2 left in that, sitting out on the couch. And when I came in to my apartment, I said to one of my roommates, "That's the man I'm going to marry." And she said, "Well, that's a joke. He's already married." And I said, well, that's unfortunate because, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to marry him. And I said, what would a married man be doing up here at these girls' dorms visiting? I said, that's rude. And she says, I don't know, but I knew him last year and he got married over the summer. And I said, I don't think so, because I don't think he would be up here if that's the case. So he called me for a date, and I accepted. And he never showed. He never showed. He invited me to a football game, and he never showed up. And so I thought, okay, so much for that. Well, come to find out, he says he was sick. And back in those days, you know, we didn't have cell phones or any of that stuff. We just had a phone that hung on the wall. So he didn't have any way to contact me. He lived in somebody's basement and didn't have a phone. But anyway, I did give him a second chance, and we started dating. And he was just the most amazing man, and I just knew that he was the one that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And it wasn't very long before he knew it too. And he never did really ask me to marry him because we just knew we were going to get married. And so it was just like a known thing. And we just moved forward with that. And so we were married in May of that year. In the meantime, he had to join them. He got drafted. And so in order to avoid the draft, he joined the Army Reserve. And so he had to go into the military. And so he went in March to Fort Ord, California. And I went home to Santa Cruz, California, and went to work so that I could earn some money. And then we got married in May. We were married in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles Temple. And we had a little reception in Santa Cruz. And when we originally started planning this, he was going to have 2 weeks between his basic training and his next training, which was going to be in Arkansas. And so we sent out the invitations to the wedding and to the wedding, and not the wedding, but the wedding reception. And we had a reception in Santa Cruz, and then we had a reception in Mesquite. Sent those out, and then his orders came. And he had only 4 days from the time that he left Fort Ord until the time he had to be in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. So we drove to, I think it was on a Friday afternoon, we drove to Los Angeles. We were married Saturday morning in the temple. We drove home Saturday afternoon, had a reception that night at the Santa Cruz ward. And the next day we had Sunday. On Monday morning, I drove him to the San Francisco airport and put him on the plane for Fort Chaffee. And then he was gone for the whole summer. So that was how we started our married life. We had a huge phone bill that summer. That was back in the day when they used to charge you by the minute for every minute you were on the phone. And I spent most of my money that I earned working paying my parents for the phone bill that Grandpa and I had while we were apart. But in the fall, we went to BYU. I actually drove to Provo. Left the car we had, which was a 1948 Chevy. It was an old thing that you had to put oil in every time you filled up with gas. And then I left the car there, and then I took the bus to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Waited until Grandpa got out of his training. Then we rode the bus back to Provo, and we found us a little. It was an old pioneer house that had been divided up into apartments, and so we had the living room and the kitchen of that house and a Murphy bed that came down out of the wall. And that was where we started our married life, and it was fairy tale exciting and fun and wonderful, and it was like that ever since. We just had such a good life together, and how I have loved and appreciated the time I had with him. We'd been married 63 and a half years when he died a year ago, September. And we just had a wonderful love affair, and I just hope he doesn't forget me while he's waiting for me on the other side. And lots of experiences that I'll talk about at another time, but that was basically our start. So I think one of the questions that Braden asked me about was if I had a motto for our family. And as I thought about it, on Grandpa's gravestone, I put a scripture quote that was from Proverbs. No, it wasn't from Proverbs. Anyway, I can't remember where it's from. But anyway, it was Joshua saying, "Choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And that has been our motto our whole married life, that we will serve the Lord. And I think for my children and my grandchildren, that's a great motto. But there's a shorter way to say it. I think there's a shorter way that encompasses it as well. But just God, family, and country. Those are the three things that are so important to each of us, that we need to align our priorities with those. God should be first in our life. Family, so important. And country, to keep our freedoms and our the privileges and things that we have in this country, because we do have freedom, and that we need to maintain those. I think those are the things that I would want my family to think as important: God, family, and country. Everything else kind of revolves around that and is encompassed under that. And if you kind of keep those things straight in your life, then things are much easier, I think. And, well, maybe not easier, but at least the hard times are easier because you have that focus.